So in today's session, and it was an interesting discussion we had in the first half, what we will be talking, or rather we will be debating on, is what kind of data and how do we go about looking at data. Because anything we do embeds on how do we measure, and it's garbage in, garbage out. Today morning we had a session where we talked about it's not about monitoring and evaluation. Rather, let me pose a question. What are we monitoring? General question. What are we monitoring? Yeah, I'll just keep on writing. Sorry. Output. Okay. Indicators. Okay. Yeah, what are we monitoring? Data. So I'm just putting out here data. Whose performance? Are we monitoring people's performance, scheme performance, or development performance? Okay. So we are talking about performance. Scheme. Okay. And why are we keeping on doing monitoring? What is the objective of monitoring? Reacher. Okay. Goal. Yeah. Corrections. And what is the end state that you look at? Reach a goal. Reach a goal of what? Purpose of what? Of development. Okay. Which we can also term as impact. Correct? So we go down to saying that we are doing what we are doing of implementing schemes to reach an impact. And it's a journey. So let me pose another question. What are the three words that come to your mind? What are the three words that come to your mind when we talk about output and outcomes? Is there a difference between impact, outcome? Forget about it. An outcome? It's an intermediate step. So let's take one scheme. Okay. And I would prefer to take Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana, but we are free to choose any scheme that you want. So let's take one scheme or two schemes. Whichever. I leave it to experts. No, I'm taking one scheme and we will do a walkthrough. We'll do a walkthrough of the scheme. So which scheme are we talking about? I mean, with the majority who would understand and relate to the schemes. So health is one, because I see many doctors in the room, so we can pick up one health, but anything else? Rural development, which one do you? MG Narega? Okay. So when we talk about health and we talk about MG Narega, and we spoke about outcome and impact. Can you go to the next slide? This is just for discussion, notional purpose. Effectively, classically one would do monitoring, and one would do monitoring of a scheme, and then they would go and do evaluation, come up with an RFP, maybe it is L1, maybe it is quality based, and it would go through a survey, and then it would come back and then say it worked or it didn't work, or what are the changes. But it's too late by then. The scheme or the view that is going on is, how do I do monitoring concurrently, or rather concurrent evaluations? How do I integrate with appropriate data sets that I have to start doing appropriate monitoring of the schemes and the interventions that are given? And with that logic of looking at, it is not necessarily that we would look at our conventional historic data that last year I did 100 vaccines, I would do 20% increase, I would do 120 vaccines. It has to also look at certain point, and I'm using vaccine, I'm not a medical doctor, but I'm just using as a reference, or 100 loans disbursement through Mudra Yojana. Is it possible for us that 100 itself was a number that should have been a different number? And that goes to the morning discussion that we had in presence of Honorable Chief Minister in terms of how do we first go to the planning, and how can we use data to look at planning. So I'm going to run next 3 slides on a quick planning exercise and how big data can be used and planning. And this is not hypothetical, it is being used in India by certain other states. So, and this is a map of what we use from either you take it from NASA or you take it from Bhuvan ISRO, NRSC. Doesn't matter. What you see over here is population density boundaries. Population density boundaries did not necessarily overlay similarly with your administrative boundaries. Correct? Which we all know. And go to the next slide, please. There is a variation from the state average, depending on each city. This is Haryana, on the state city. Now, what we look at is that we look at this. Of course, we cannot change the district boundaries. Let's look at another dimension that is available publicly within the system. And that is on street density by district. And when we look at the street density, next slide, by district, what we find is where there is more population, the density is not in, street density is not in proportion to the population. Okay, which means at that planning stage, is there certain things that can be provided as an input? And I'm not necessarily saying that it would be necessarily at the state level. And this could be reflected into any of the planning that we go on. In similar way, what we looked at is we looked at nightlight data. And in nightlight data, we use nightlight data to look at luminosity, which has a direct correlation, and the literature talks about it, with population GDP, loans, transactions, various economic factors, not necessarily social factors. And this, go next slide, please. And this is again a net state domestic product. Now, what does it mean? The Bureau does not publish a district or a block level GDP. Can I use nightlight and again work back the surrogate to find out is the growth happening? And that aids that into the planning process. So where we are coming from is we don't necessarily have to look at only our existing administrative data, but within the government agencies, there are other data providers that have been provided. And that can also be leveraged. This is just an illustrative example, not to be going by as a sacrosanct example of implementation, but be it mobility data or be it transactional data based on NPCI or based on ISRO, NRSC. We can leverage different types of data to first do our planning exercise. And that's when we talk about, we are only talking about top-down. And when we talk about top-down, we are talking about the map, not the territory, as Shailendra ji always mentions. We're talking about a top-down approach. And what we are talking over here when we talk about these details is the actual territory. Before I go on to the impact, and we will take two schemes that what we spoke and just walk through and do a collaborative exercise. You have any thoughts on what I was speaking to?
The problem,
I can hear it.
I'm from Haryana, Carter. The problem with such proxy indicators is that once they realize that you're measuring district GDP through lights, no, they'll put a lot of lights. Like gamification is very good in Haryana. There's a lot of monitoring support, like not the support system, but the monitoring framework. So proxy indicators kind of give a worse picture than no indicators sometimes, I feel.
I agree. And that's when you need to have statistical tools to identify something called as gridification, when those lots of lights are going on. And that can be identified statistically. I agree completely. And what you have to also do is triangulation. We did an exercise where we mapped nightlight data, mobility data, infection data on loan repayment of SHG and MFI members. 3 differently on group loans and looked at their behavior. Because end of the day, you are spot on. It is not gospel truth. It is only a plausible conjecture. So where we am coming from is when you start doing planning, you start building a plausible conjecture and then build a scheme. And the intelligence that you people have on the ground cannot be replaced by any of these data.
But the light, you're categorizing it as output, outcome, or impact. What is the light to you? Like in this?
It is neither, as in from a scheme level, it is neither. It is neither output, and that's when, if you hold your thought, we will come back to your question. Just hold your thought. We'll walk through the process. Okay. So which 2 schemes do we take? We take Manrega and health, 1 scheme. J. Now, can you tell a little bit about the first scheme?
Yeah, Janani Shishu Suraksha Karyakram, where all the pregnant mothers and the infants are given support for the hospital stay for the mother. Their logistic, their pickup, drop is given free by the government.
And what's the objective of the scheme?
So that the mothers, we reduce on the out-of-pocket expenditure, and the mothers avail the services, and we reduce the IMR and the neonatal death.
Okay.
Up to 1 year, and the infant death, because up to 1 year, under JSSK, the child's whole hospital stay and the treatment is covered. Pick-up, drop for both the mother during pregnancy.
Okay, infant death and
MMR.
Maternal mortality,
Yes.
I would assume. Okay. Now, what's the objective of MG Narega? What would be the objective? I mean, it's there in the EFC documents. Yeah.
100 days employment.
Yeah.
In a year.
Is that the objective? What would be the impact that this scheme would cause?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Income support.
Income support? Yeah. reduction in rural poverty,
Livelihood promotion of the
and
household.
livelihood promotion. There
And
would be many.
creation of durable
But
assets.
okay, sorry.
Creation of durable assets.
Observe. Okay, assets. Now, if I take this scheme, what I would say is that these are outcomes. Are they impacts? X percentage of the people that who work, I'm just taking examples, need to be women. Is this correct? In the scheme, or it's open? Open. Can we say that overall, when we talk about poverty reduction, the impact in the long run is also empowerment? Coming out of poverty? Yeah? And if it is coming out of poverty and having a sustainable income by virtue of creating certain livelihood assets like piggery or poultry, then does this impact of economic empowerment has a bearing on maternal mortality? Which means when we look at a scheme at an impact level from a citizen's perspective, do we necessarily, we might be looking at a scheme as a scheme implementation. But for the citizen, it is one indicator called as development. And as we spoke, as in the morning it was mentioned by in the session about the 4 Ps, and we talk about the 4 Ps. There are two parts. One is actual development and acknowledgement that there is development. There could be development and there could be no acknowledgement that there is actually development happening. So, for example, if I am coming from US and I'm coming over in Shillong or in Mumbai or somewhere, and I say that, oh, this is not as developed as where I come from. But if you are coming back into Shillong after 10 years, you would say this place has transformed. So there are reference points on what we measure impact. And once we start measuring impacts, we come down cascading backwards to look at what is my outcome and what is the activities required to meet those outcomes. And at what stage these two schemes actually needs to be co-integrated, or there is a natural confluence. Another example that I can share is when we look at SHG capacity building and we give loan grant or support SHG. And if we look at a framework which talks about resource, agency, and outcome, a capability framework, we are focusing on providing resource. There are schemes that work specifically on skill building and literacy. Unless and until they are complemented over here, how would we achieve the required objective? And that's where it looks at, when we look at data, rightfully so, it necessarily grounds up data, does not necessarily need to look at, while it need to report it and measure it as a scheme level, but we also have to have a different view. And that different view is about overall multi-dimensional development. Because there are interrelations that could possibly happen. Now, we spoke about, in the overall process, we spoke about how do we, our objective is to measure, monitor performance. How would you monitor a performance? If I take this scheme, how would you monitor this performance? Let's do a walkthrough. What do you do when you when we start, what do we do when we start the scheme? So there is a grant of say 50 lakh rupees given at a DC. So there is a VEC, there is a secretary. What's the process?
VECs are the main implementing agency at the grassroots level.
VEC,
so we have the
right?
VECs. The
Yeah.
VECs have
Who represents VEC?
they have a chairman and a secretary.
So let's say for now secretary, yeah.
Yeah.
What they do? What would they do?
They usually prepare an annual action plan.
Okay, annual action plan. What support would from the NRLM or from the DC office would they require?
They are
Did the
looking-
block officer involvement be there?
Yes.
So there is an
the BDO
involvement
will
of block
the
officer?
BDO, yeah.
Okay.
Then
Where
the-
does this annual action plan come to?
It will be submitted by the VEC to the block development office,
Okay. And from here
to the district, DC, DPC.
to the DC. Right.
And
So the
again-
first step, and I'll hold you over there. The first step over there is, no. I mean, I want to ask you a question. Is that you need to have a secretary and you need to have a VEC formed. Correct? Is there a data point that says that X villages have a VEC and there is a okay, so that point is taken. One. Now your planning exercise might start in December, October. When would you require the annual action plan coming to you?
January.
January. That means they have to convene a meeting.
Yes.
Do we know at NRLM that has the meeting for a particular VEC being convened?
NRLM, yeah, they do.
How?
Basically the secretary along with the block will
Okay.
be giving some kind of a notice and
Okay.
information.
You have a notice over here
Yes.
and that gets communicated via the channel to NRLM, right? Now, in this process, a data point itself is not the notice. The data point is the date of the notice, because that is critical. The content of the notice is not critical. Content of the annual action plan is critical. So when we talk about data, we have to decipher between important and good to have. Because your planning process will be based on, if that meeting is not happening, then you don't get the effective document. So between October and January, the focus would be on how many of those meetings have happened, not on what was necessarily agreed over there. When it comes over here, it would be the content of the data. Now, let's take another example of vaccination, immunization, right? You got immunization. How do you do between 3 to 5 years? How do you know how many kids have to be immunized? How do you have the head count?
The workers, the ASHAs and the ANMs, they actually have the head count of the number of infants and the children under 5 years. So on every session, that head count, that is we call the due beneficiary release. That is given one to the Anganwadi worker, one to the ASHA and one to the headman. And they paste it in the village.
So the question is, how does the list originate? I don't know, so I'm asking you.
So what happens is that when any deliveries happen, the ASHA and the Anganwadi, they already have the records. They have to do the actual head count.
Okay.
Yes.
And if it is going to be some vaccination between 3 to 5 years, how would they do?
That also we have the head count.
And how would they do? They do date of birth plus 5?
No, actual head count.
No. So how would they do? Go
They
and
visit.
count?
Yeah, they go. They go.
Is there a system where, hypothetically, because there cannot be any perfect process, if you have your birth registry and your death registry, and you have got your Anganwadi enrollment, you can triangulate these 3 points.
Yes, that also we can.
That also you can.
Yes.
Now that becomes a data point to optimize the process, but as we mentioned, we don't necessarily rely till we Trust but verify.
Yes, and
that's where I think we got to start looking at breaking each of our processes together, and the granular performance management that we were having a discussion yesterday workshop is not about performance management of an individual. We are talking about performance management of how do we help and support execution of the scheme. So based on our first diagram, the early signals can be sooner the better to be communicated to the right stakeholders. And that's what we think is the power of looking at different data. And I would look at this data as in 3 or 4 parts. One is your administrative data. Second part is transactional data. Any transaction that, and I'll explain that. Third part is your alternative data. What we are looking at is not just using and leveraging administrative data, but also triangulating it with transactional and or alternative data like we saw. And what is transactional data? If a vehicle passes using a FASTag, the axle capacity of the vehicle, which gives the load of how much goods possibly worth is there, because you look at your bill of lading, is captured by NPCI. That gives you the vehicular movement. And I'm not saying that we have an institutionalized mechanism where each state can go and get into NPC and get that data out at an aggregate level, not an individual level from a privacy perspective. But those kind of data sets do exist somewhere within our system, and we have to, it's a journey to try and exploit that. So, last slide. Go next. So, it's when we look at pure, and I'm a data quant guy by profession. We used to look only at p-values and not answering what is happening, yes and no. For us, everybody was a number. But the moment we work with people on the ground, we also start looking at why. And I think that why is more learning, more rich, more exploratory to add value to scheme changes and suggestions. I wouldn't say that it is or that you can only do why and not how and how much, but it has to coexist. And that's where our journey tomorrow, as we are looking at monitoring, is actually looking at various data parameters. That's all from my side. Thank you.